Hi everyone, it's me Gaming Dew, and it is time for our first cartoon review post me leaving the Loud House. But what are we gonna do today? What are we gonna review? Well, it's not exactly a review, rather it's going to be a top 10. Yes guys, today we're doing one of the result polls, and I was actually quite surprised that this show won the poll, but here we are. Today, I am going to be talking about one of the most underrated cartoons ever made, Dan Versus. This show is basically about a man named Dan who lives with his cat, Mr. Mumbles, and basically is mad at the entire world and stuff like that, and will stop at nothing to extract revenge on the things that wrong him. It's a freaking hilarious show. You also have his friend Chris and his wife Elise, and the whole cast of characters together just brings one of the funniest cartoons ever made. Adult cartoon or not, and this is not an adult cartoon, obviously. It originally was gonna be, but yeah. So, what are my top 10 favorite episodes of Dan Versus? Well, you'll just have to wait and find out. Coming in as my 10th favorite episode of Dan Versus, we have Dan Versus the Common Cold. So, this episode is basically all about, well, Dan getting the common cold. And he figures out a way on how to extract revenge on it. Where basically Chris tells him that's not really feasible, and to just find a cure for it. So Dan sneaks into this secret lab to find a cure, and the evil scientist that basically gives him this deadly, untested disease makes him even sicker. This episode is just so freaking funny with the lengths Dan is willing to go to get better. He's willing to take this untested potion basically to make him feel better and stuff like that. I freaking love this episode. And it's only at the number 10 spot. Number 9, however, is also related to Dan going to another medical office. That being Dan versus the dentist. So in this episode, it's basically about Dan needing to repay Chris for Elise's birthday. So he gets his old teddy bear out that he got from the dentist, and Chris says that'll repay him, basically. Until they try to fight over it, until it knocks Dan's tooth out. And he tries to replace his tooth in other ways, but then decides to go to the dentist. He thinks initially that the dentist did this on purpose so he could just go there to visit. Well, it turns out the dentist did do it on purpose, and Dan was right all along. In fact, that dentist is a supervillain. What a freaking hilarious twist. This episode is so funny. It makes me laugh every freaking time I watch it. Especially when Dan first goes into the office and starts screaming and scaring the little kids in the waiting room. I find that gut-busting. This episode is absolutely hilarious and is my 9th favorite episode of the series. My number 8 is Dan versus Anger Management. This is literally the perfect episode for Dan, in the sense that Dan is finally sentenced to go to anger management. And so is Chris, but actually for the polar opposite reason that he doesn't get angry enough. What I love about this episode is it turns out the ultimate most crazy person in this episode is not Dan. It's his anger management manager, as she basically gets him he teaches her about the power of revenge and stuff like that, and that don't hold your anger in all the time and try to get revenge on the people that wronged you. She takes it way too far as she gets revenge on her sister and stuff like that. And eventually, as Chris basically trashes the entire anger management spot, her biggest anger inducer is littering. So she gets pissed and basically goes on a freaking rampage with a chainsaw chasing Chris and stuff like that. This episode is an absolute laugh riot. My favorite moment is the very end where Dan finds those squirrels that he was trying to hunt after, and it was just such a freaking hilarious ending. Yet another episode that's an absolute classic. My number 7 is Dan vs. BurgerFile. What I love about this episode is how far Dan is willing to go to prove that his order was wrong. That he didn't want any cheese on his burger, but it turned out that there was. He is willing to go so far to chain himself to the counter until they get his order right. If that's not Dan for you, then I don't know what is. Also in this episode, we meet his love interest, Hortense, who is basically a worker at BurgerFile, and she has a crush on him too. Now later, the second and only other appearance she has in the series is, spoiler alert, my least favorite episode in all of Dan versus The Wedding. But we may go into the top 10 worst episodes, but I don't think there's a single episode of Dan versus that I hate, so it probably won't be that interesting. But if you want to see a worst episodes anyways, leave it in the comments below. I'm just probably not going to get too angry at it, ironically, because of how angry Dan gets. But anyways, Dan vs. BurgerFile, though, is definitely in the top 10. It's such a funny episode. Number 6 is Dan vs. New Mexico. So this episode is basically about Dan trying to get revenge on the state of New Mexico. And, all sorts of funny hijinks happen and stuff like that. Dan going after an entire state is freaking hilarious. Especially that him, Chris, and Elise go on an entire road trip to New Mexico just to get revenge on it. This has some of the best banter between Dan and Chris in the entire series, in my opinion. Especially that scene where Chris is shushing Dan at the library. He beats the shit out of him with a book, and then they get into a fist fight. That's freaking hilarious. I absolutely love that. Dan vs. New Mexico is, I think it's the very first episode in the whole series. I think it depends on who you talk to, but it might be the Wolfman. If not, New Mexico is the second episode. But it's one of the first episodes of the series, so it's a great introduction to the series in general. Number 5 is Dan vs. the Animal Shelter. This episode is where Dan basically gets his true best friend. Chris is sort of what he'd call his best friend, but more or less his assistant. But in this episode, he gets his true best friend, his cat, Mr. Mumbles, who is absolutely adorable. But he still wants to get on revenge on the animal shelter, as it's built across from his apartment, and it keeps him up all night with all the dogs and cats going off and stuff like that. And this episode is just really heartwarming, honestly. It's one of the most heartwarming episodes of the show. I really appreciate that. So, in my opinion, bringing us into the top 5 is Dan vs. the Animal Shelter. What's better than Dan going after an entire state? How about Dan going after an entire freaking country? Coming in at number 4 is Dan versus Canada. So, what does Dan get mad at today? The whole country of Canada. And what he does is try to extract his revenge by going up to the country and, in the beginning, he gets stuck with maple syrup. His comic books have been replaced with this Saskatchewan hero and stuff like that. And as a half Canadian, which, if you guys didn't know that, I'm half Canadian because my father is Canadian. I don't know if you could tell because I maybe have a slight Canadian accent. But anyways, it pisses Dan off enough to travel up to Canada to strike his revenge. And then they find out Chris is 1/16th Canadian. Hey Chris, I'm more Canadian than you are, so I can say most of the jokes about Canada and stuff like that are not offensive. It's actually really funny. But I love this episode. I love the fact that Dan is willing to get revenge on an entire country. That is so freaking hilarious and brings it at the number 4 spot. How about an episode where Dan takes on himself? Coming in at my number 3 is Dan versus Dan. So in this episode, an imposter version of Dan. I'm sorry for making an Among Us joke in 2024, but I had to. A version of Dan that's an imposter basically takes over his life and takes over his house, remodels it, owns Mr. Mumbles and everything. And Dan is basically trying to tell Elise and Chris about it, but they don't believe him at all. They think he's finally gone really crazy and stuff like that. Seeing Dan fight a version of himself, basically try to get revenge on a version of himself, is freaking amazing. And brings some of the funniest moments of the entire series. I just love seeing Dan pretend to change his ways only to get revenge on the other Dan. It is such a fun episode. I love that. I initially was actually going to put this at number 1, but I found 2 more episodes that I just like a little more. And coming in at number 2, my second favorite episode in all of Dan Versus is Dan versus Gundo Mart. So this episode is Dan basically trying to take down Costco or Sam's Club, which is freaking hilarious. Now, I haven't been to Costco or Sam's Club that often, but I've been there a few times, and these bulk businesses are basically trying to take down Dan's favorite local businesses, so he thinks to strike revenge on this store. Except Chris actually adores this store and will get everything in bulk and stuff like that, and it is an absolute freaking amazing episode. I love the ways Dan will go to sort of take down this store once and for all and stuff like that, and it's just such a funny episode, and it is close to being my number 1. But my number 1 is actually an episode that I think encompasses all of the aspects of Dan Versus perfectly. What is that number 1 episode? It is an episode where the thing Dan gets revenge on, I'm sure absolutely everybody hates. And that is Jury Duty. My favorite episode in all of Dan Versus is Dan Versus Jury Duty. I think every single amazing aspect of Dan Versus is wrapped together in a beautiful little package here. You have the character relationships with Dan and Chris, and especially Dan and Elise. I love their bond in this episode and stuff like that, where they're sort of rivals, and Dan seems like they're gonna be friendly and stuff like that, but he gets Elise in trouble and stuff like that. My favorite moment is where Dan disguises himself as the judge and ultimately freaking judges everyone and stuff like that. I love the place where they put the misbehaving defendants basically in a freaking hamster cage. This episode just has it all. It has Chris being Chris, basically pretending to be a defendant, and but he's actually not really one, and I don't know, this episode just has everything right with a Dan Versus episode, in my opinion. So ultimately, that leads me to pick out Dan Versus Jury Duty as the #1 episode in the entire series for me. So yeah, that's about it, guys. I hope you guys like this video. Leave a suggestion for an individual Dan Versus episode you'd like me to review. I will get to that soon. First, I'm going to release content related to Jimmy Neutron and Chowder before I do another Dan Versus video. And probably also something related to SpongeBob as well. So, you'll see another Dan Versus video probably in a month or two. But I hope you guys enjoyed this top 10, and that's about it. Gaming Do here. See you later. Bye.